Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my series on where not to start with authors who I've read a lot of books by. This week's is a little unusual because this week I'm talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, despite the fact of being an American icon or an iconic American author, at least for a long time he was considered that, he really wasn't that prolific. I think he only wrote something like 4.5 novels during his lifetime. Lots of short stories, which I'll talk about later. But, in part, I think Fitzgerald is as famous for his life, his fairly tragic life, and, the lifestyle he led. He's as famous for that as I think he is sometimes for his work. So let me just get started with places where I would not start. 3 books or 3 aspects or pieces of Fitzgerald's work I would not start with. To begin with, I would not start reading Fitzgerald by reading Fitzgerald's first book. I'm sorry if you can't read that. Fitzgerald's first book was This Side of Paradise. He wrote it as a very young man, just out of college, and it details the story of a young man in college, in the military, and then just after college who has some success as a writer. In other words, This Side of Paradise is clearly based on Fitzgerald's own experiences as a student at Princeton, as an officer in the United States Army, even though Fitzgerald, unlike his character Amory Blaine, doesn't actually go overseas during World War I. And then, his romance, his falling in love, etc. This book probably has some interest might have some interest to people as kind of a school days book. In a certain extent, it's that. If you are interested in Fitzgerald, this is a good book to read. But I just think it's kind of a bad place to start because the book itself is so much about being young in those years right after World War I and it's so much of that time period in terms of its use of language and the way in which the dialogue works that today, to me, it feels quite stilted. It feels really mannered. It feels kind of, almost like a parody of being emotional and young and all those kind of things. And I just don't think it translates very well into, today's world. Now, after you've read other Fitzgerald, you might want to go back and read to see kind of where he started. It's not that the story isn't interesting. I think it is. And it's not that the story isn't well written. I think it is. I think Fitzgerald was just a great writer of sentences and stories, but it's just not the place I would start. Along those same lines, I would avoid at least the early short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'll be honest with you, I find Fitzgerald's stories to be, short stories to have a tendency to be long and relatively boring, and a lot of things I said about This Side of Paradise would be true of Fitzgerald's early short stories as well. Now, I haven't read the short stories he wrote later in his life. I've been told by some people that there's some quite good short stories there, so I can't speak to that. But the stories you see most often anthologized, I think, would be The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, and then maybe The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And I don't think any of those stories are particularly good stories. I think they're overly long. They're too much of the time period. They have that kind of stilted dialogue of the time period. Fitzgerald was known as the writer of the Jazz Age, the voice of the Jazz Age, and to a real extent in a lot of the 1920s he played into that in his writing. I also don't think it helped that Fitzgerald was paid an exorbitant amount of money by the Saturday Evening Post for his short stories, as long as they conformed to the Saturday Evening Post idea of what a short story should be like. And so what you get is Fitzgerald writing short stories for the Saturday Evening Post, who I think paid him the ridiculous amount of $1,500 a story. He's writing those stories essentially just for money, and he's conforming his style and his subject and his content to what the Saturday Evening Post will take. And there's nothing wrong with a writer doing that and earning money by doing that, but I do think it affects the quality of the stories. I do think it affects what Fitzgerald chose to write about, and I just don't care for that. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button and Bernice Bobs Her Hair, I think, are particularly not good stories. And then the easiest book for me to tell you, not as a place not to start with Fitzgerald, is actually with his last novel, and that's the Last Tycoon. The Last Tycoon is an incomplete novel. He died before he finished it, which is a shame because I think it's a good. I think he was off to a really good start, and the writing here is really good. He really labored over his writing, and I think labored to kind of live up to the reputation he thought he'd established for himself with This Side of Paradise. And so he produced books slowly. This book is incomplete, and when I say it's incomplete, I literally mean it just stops, and it doesn't go on from there. And unlike a lot of other, unlike Hemingway, who had novels published posthumously with people coming in and assembling and editing the ends of the books he hadn't quite finished, that doesn't really happen here with The Last Tycoon. So when you become a Fitzgerald completist, definitely read it. I think you will find it rewarding in that respect, but not a good place to start. So the rest of this video then, and what I usually do in these videos is I give you suggestions of places to start. Well, with Fitzgerald, there really is only one place to start, and that's with The Great Gatsby. So the rest of this video, I'm going to assume you've read The Great Gatsby, because if you haven't read The Great Gatsby, that's where you should start with F. Scott Fitzgerald. It is, in my opinion, a great book. It is still one of those books which I think comes under the heading of, truly a great American novel, in which Fitzgerald explores kind of the hollowness of the American dream and the idea of his generation, I think, that they would never achieve that kind of happiness, that kind of completeness that they hope to, that greed and wealth and other things had kind of destroyed the old ideas of American values, and what you had is a generation of young people in a world where there weren't necessarily values. And it is, I think, a great book, a book I've read and reread a number of times. So that would be the place to start. But if you have read The Great Gatsby, then the rest of this list would be for you of things to read after you've read The Great Gatsby. And the place to go, I think, after The Great Gatsby is Fitzgerald's next novel, which is Tender as the Night. I think there's 7 years between the publication of The Great Gatsby and Tender as the Night. And in that time period, Fitzgerald had become, I think, incredibly cynical about life, about marriage, about all kinds of things, and that cynicism is here in Tender as the Night. This book is bleak and grim, so Thomas Hardy fans who are looking to get into F. Scott Fitzgerald, this might be the place, because there's not a lot of happiness here. And one of the things I think is interesting about Fitzgerald is that his novels kind of describe, I think, the arc of his life to a certain extent. You have kind of the wide-eyed, hopeful, optimistic, but wised-up Amory Blaine, in This Side of Paradise, in The Beautiful and Damned. You have a married couple who are realizing, that marriage is difficult and that their lifestyle may be contributing to their problems, which, is kind of true of Fitzgerald. In The Great Gatsby, you have Fitzgerald questioning traditional American values and the American dream and what it means to be successful or happy in America. And then in Tender as the Night, you just have complete cynical, everything kind of sucks kind of a novel, but it is very good, and I definitely think it's Fitzgerald's second best work. The rest of the books I'm going to recommend about Fitzgerald are not works of fiction by Fitzgerald, because I think with Fitzgerald what I found is that his life is actually more interesting in lots of cases than the books and the stories that he wrote. So the next book I would suggest is a place to start after having read The Great Gatsby. Would be a collection of essays and writings by Fitzgerald and some about Fitzgerald called The Crack-Up. This was collected by his friend Edmund Wilson. It contains essays that he wrote for Esquire magazine, I believe, and they were collected in this book along with letters he wrote. And this book is really, I think, provides some insight into Fitzgerald and the struggles that he had with depression and with all the things going on in his life and his marriage. There's information about his writing process. There are kind of transcriptions of his notebooks of random thoughts and ideas, and I just find this to be really interesting. So if you've read The Great Gatsby, you think, okay, I want to read something else, and then you read Tender as the Night maybe, or maybe you read The Great Gatsby and go, I don't really want to read Fitzgerald's fiction, but I'm interested in Fitzgerald. maybe pick up maybe read the Wikipedia biography of Fitzgerald and then pick up the Crack Up, because you do get some insight into Fitzgerald, into his mind, into his struggles, into his creative process, can be found there. And then the third place I would go after reading The Great Gatsby, and my third suggestion of place to go after The Great Gatsby, would be a book that contains Fitzgerald's letters. I think the best of those is Dear Scott, Dear Zelda, The Love Letters of F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. This is kind of like the biography of a marriage in epistolary terms. Essentially, it's just letters back and forth from the two or to others about one of the other two. And it really tells kind of a sad story of their marriage, gives you some real insight into both Fitzgerald and Zelda, and what their relationship was like. And I just found it to be really interesting and fascinating. If you're just interested in F. Scott Fitzgerald more as a working writer, then a book of his letters like F. Scott Fitzgerald, A Life in Letters, will contain a lot of his work-related letters to his editor, Max Perkins at Scribner's, as well as lots of other authors, etc. There are letters to Zelda in here. There's also another collection that's older called Dear Scott, Dear Max, which is basically a collection of letters between F. Scott Fitzgerald and his editor, Max Perkins. Fitzgerald was a regular letter writer. He probably wrote, anywhere between 4 and 10 letters a day to various people. And he was a good letter writer. His letters are interesting and chatty and open and honest, and there's kind of a directness in his letters about what's going on with him and his struggles. And he's kind of like we think about modern people today, sharing too much. Fitzgerald, shared a lot in his letters, and I find them really interesting. And so that would be another place I would go after you've read The Great Gatsby. If you're not really interested in Fitzgerald's fiction, but interested in Fitzgerald himself, those books of letters, I think, are really good. Anyway, there you go. There's my list of where not to start with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and some suggestions of what of Fitzgerald's books and works to read after you've read The Great Gatsby. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.